All right. So not last week, 2 weeks ago, we started going through, this is sort of the heart of the Sermon on the Mount. We're getting into the meat of it right now, and Jesus talked last time. I'm going to see we don't know which one of these remotes works. Not that one, that one. And Jesus started talking about a new kind of righteousness and a new way that if you're going to be one of Jesus' people, Jesus explaining, this is how I want you to live. And so we looked at the old righteousness, which was, don't murder. And most of us do pretty good at not murdering people. But he says, I want you to not just murder, but I want you not to hold on to anger in your heart against other people. I want you not just to not murder, but not talk about people in a way that brings them down, that dehumanizes them. So this week we're going to look at two more that we just read here about Jesus' new kind of righteousness. So if you have your Bibles, open them to Matthew 5, starting at 27. And we just read this passage here, and we're going to focus in on the first half of it first. And I want to say two things about this passage, observations that we need to just start with observing here. First of all, Jesus is talking to married people. This passage usually gets preached to single people and usually to guys, but Jesus is actually talking to married people, and it applies equally to men and to women. Single people can commit sexual sins, and there's all kinds of words in Scripture for that, but adultery is a sin that only a married person can commit. You can't commit adultery if you're not married. So Jesus here, first of all, understand Jesus is talking about marriage and to married people. There's going to be applications for single people as well, but the context here to understand, Jesus is talking about marriage. And second, we need to understand what the actual sin is that Jesus is condemning. We often hear this as, if you commit adultery in your heart, it's the same as if you commit adultery. That's not actually what Jesus says. They might be the same thing. I'd say probably not. But we often equate these. If you commit adultery in your heart, it's the same thing as if you committed adultery. Jesus doesn't say that in this passage. And we're going to unpack this to see what adultery in your heart actually looks like. So Jesus says, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully. This word lustfully needs to be unpacked a little bit. ESV says with lustful intent. The Good News translation maybe has the best, says, and wants to possess her. So we think of this word lust, and in this context, we often think of this as a sexual kind of thing. It's not. It can be that, but it's desiring. You're looking at someone else and you want them. So the assumption here, Jesus is saying, is that you're married to someone and you're looking at someone else who's not your husband, who's not your wife, and you're saying, I want them instead of my wife or instead of my husband, or I want them in addition to my husband or my wife. There is a desire, there's a wanting. This is going to pick up on, last week we talked about desires a lot, or Chris Frost did when he was here. So technically, this looking and wanting is not adultery, right? I can look at another woman and say, boy, I wish I had her, and I haven't broken the 10 Commandments. I haven't actually committed adultery. Now, Jesus wants to take that deeper. He says, when you're looking at that person lustfully, looking at that person and wanting them, you've already entered down the path towards adultery. So Jesus wants to bring a new righteousness to our marriage. It's not just enough to say, I haven't done it, I haven't committed adultery, I haven't cheated on my husband, haven't cheated on my wife. Jesus actually wants to look a little bit deeper into our hearts. What are we looking for? What are we longing for? What are we desiring? There's lots of cases of adultery out there. Probably most of us know of someone personally whose marriage has been through it, and we see them on the news and media all the time. I've never, in my time, ever heard of a spontaneous case of adultery where you've got pick on the husbands here because I'm a guy, a husband who loves his wife, they've got a great marriage, everything is fantastic, and he goes away on a business trip and ends up committing adultery. That just almost never, maybe it does happen, I've never heard of that happening. There's always something happening long before that. And this is what Jesus wants to talk about, is this longing in your heart that's not adultery, but it's leading you down that path. I don't know if any of you have read this book. I would recommend it for husbands and wives. It's called Marriage Undercover by Bob and Audrey Meisner. there with the It's a New Day ministry. And this is a book that they talk about their marriage and how they went through an adultery in their marriage. And there was actually a child that came out of this affair. And they talk about how it wasn't just this one out-of-the-blue kind of thing, but it was this long thing that had started years before and grew into this. And it's a great book to tell their story and to help you as husbands and wives to sort of cover your marriage to prevent this from happening. So what Jesus wants to say is there's things on the heart level in our marriages that we need to protect that happen long before anybody actually commits adultery. Does that make sense? Okay, this is what Jesus is pointing at, something that's long before. And when you see this happening, Jesus says, when you notice in your mind that, boy, there's somebody I'm looking for, somebody I'm desiring, here's what Jesus wants you to do. If your right eye caused you to sin, gouge it out. If your hand caused you to sin, cut it off. Jesus wants you to radically amputate anything in your life that might take you down that road of sin. It's obviously hyperbole. Jesus is exaggerating to make a point. He doesn't actually want you to cut out your eyes or cut off your hands. You could still be just as guilty of those sins without an eye or without a hand. It's not going to fix it for you. Jesus' point is, don't hold back. When you see something that's leading you that way, pluck it out, cut it off, get rid of it as fast as you can. There's a sense of urgency. Remember a couple weeks ago we talked about reconciling with a brother or sister, and Jesus says even if you're going to the temple and you're offering your super holy spiritual sacrifice to God, and you remember that somebody has something against you, he says leave your sacrifice, go get it fixed right away. We talked about being in the baptismal tank, right? If you're in the tank and you remember there's a problem, get out of the tank, go get reconciled with your brother or sister, then get baptized. There's an urgency. Let's do this now. And Jesus has this same sort of urgency when it comes to these kind of sins. He says, deal with it now. And he gives a pretty graphic picture. Jesus could have just said, if you see this, stop it. But he gives two, if you think about it, really graphic pictures. I don't know if you want to think about how it would look to gouge out your eye. That's a violent, bloody, horrible picture. I don't know if any of you have read this wonderful book. I read it in junior high. Anybody read The Hand of Robin Squires? Nobody? Nobody reads these? Oh, our school system. It's a great book about searching for gold on Oak Island in Nova Scotia. You've heard of this? And it's a fiction. And this young guy, Robin Squires, gets trapped at the bottom of a mine, and his hand is handcuffed to a big stump or something down there. He can't get free, and he knows they're going to flood it with water, and he's going to die. And the only way out is for him to get his friend down there with an axe to chop off his hand, and then he gets out. The Hand of Robin Squires. Read it. It's a great book. Maybe this is a bit uncomfortable. I found, if you look online, you can find more than one story of farmers who get caught in machinery and had to cut off an arm or a leg to get free. These things happen. It's uncomfortable to talk about cutting off your leg or a hand. It's gross, and maybe we shouldn't talk about it on Sunday morning. That's the whole point. Jesus wants to give you an image that's gross and violent and uncomfortable because he says, this is what you have to do. It's like chopping off your own hand to get rid of whatever it is in your life that's causing you to stumble, causing you to sin. So he wants to get this point across. And we know how we can sin with our hand. There's lots of things you can do with your hand that are sinful. But how do you sin with your eye? That's kind of strange to think about. How do you sin with your eyeball? Well, your eye longs for things. It looks for things. It's desiring things. It wants things, and that's why the eye is a problem. And what desire does, this is what Jesus' brother James says in James 1:15. He says, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. So that looking, we think sort of our eyes are innocent. You can't sin with your eyes. The eyes bring desire. The grandchild of desire is death. That's why Jesus says it's really important to think, what are you longing for? What are you wanting to have in your life? I want to tell you a couple stories of what this looks like. Had a student in Mile 2 a few years ago, not a Crystal City student. I don't think we had any Crystal City students that year. And we had a teacher in class who was talking about this passage. Cutting off your hand or your eye, anything that's causing you to sin, get rid of it. And he said, this is how we should do this as Christians. If there's something in our life that's causing us to sin, we should get rid of it, no matter how hard it is or how difficult it is. And so we had this student in the class, and while the teacher was saying this, he thought, my phone is causing me to sin. I'm using my phone to look at stuff I shouldn't look at. And he got up in the middle of class, and he walked. We had a little shelf, some of you will remember this, where you put your phone when you come into the classroom, so you're not on your phone in the middle of class. And he went and he got his phone off the shelf, and he said, I'm going to smash my phone because it's causing me to sin. And the students in the class said, whoa, you don't need to do that. And the teacher said, whoa, no, don't smash your phone. That's a little bit crazy. Don't do that. And when class was over, and all the naysayers were gone, he took his phone and he smashed it. And I never invited that teacher back to teach again. That's what it looks like to cut off your hand or to pluck out your eye. There's something in your life that's causing you to sin, something you're desiring that's taking you away from God. Do whatever it takes to get rid of that. That's what it looks like. Another story in the context of marriage. In the first half of our marriage, Nikki and I sat down with another couple who were older. They were probably about where we are now with kind of teenager kids. And they told a story. I'm not sure if it was at a marriage conference or what. And the husband, good Christian man, faithful in ministry, never unfaithful to his wife, a good guy all around. He had a desire in his heart for another woman, and he couldn't get rid of it. And he kept thinking about this woman, and it was just always there, and he didn't want it, but he was just attracted to this woman, and he couldn't get rid of it. He tried to pray, it wouldn't go away, and finally he felt like, I got to tell my wife about this. So he told his wife, and he said, just so you know, this is in me. I don't want it to be, but I'm attracted to this woman. And she just burst out in laughter. And she says, that's funny, because I'm attracted to her husband. It's okay, you can laugh, that's okay. These were good Christian people. These desires, these temptations weren't bad. It didn't mean they were bad people. They get tempted, just like you and I get tempted. And when they brought it out into the open, it had no hold on them anymore. That didn't grow into adultery in the heart. If they left that alone and nursed those feelings for a couple years, that could have turned into actual adultery. But it didn't. They threw the door wide open and they said, this is what it is. Jesus, deal with it. And he did, and all those feelings went away. Nikki and I have had similar conversations in our marriage. We want to be open and talking about anything in us that's a temptation away from each other. And it doesn't mean there's anything wrong if you have those temptations. We have them. But Jesus says, when they show up, cut out your eye, chop off your hand, do whatever it takes to get rid of it. So even if you have those desires, maybe you don't have to talk to your spouse if that's not a place you're in, but talk to someone, get that out so it doesn't grow into something ugly. The old law was, don't cheat on your spouse. That's in the 10 Commandments. Don't commit adultery. Jesus' new righteousness is to go deeper. Not just don't cheat on your spouse, but when you see anything in your heart that's starting to lead you away, get rid of it as quickly and as painfully or whatever as you can. So that the typical the Jewish practice was, if a Jewish man saw another woman that he wanted, he would simply divorce his wife and marry that woman. And according to the law, he was okay. He didn't break any of the laws. He divorced her. He married her. Now, he didn't commit adultery. And Jesus says, if that's your plan, it's adulterous from the start. That's what adultery in the heart means. It means you haven't actually committed adultery, but your whole plan is adulterous. The old law was just divorce your wife, give her a certificate of divorce, send her away and marry someone else. Okay, so that leads us to the next one about divorce. We're going to talk a little bit about divorce this morning. And Jesus said, if anyone, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you, anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. Anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So the Old Testament doesn't actually say a lot about divorce. Very, very little about divorce in the Old Testament. There's basically one passage in Deuteronomy. I just gave you the first verse here. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, he gives her a certificate of divorce and sends her away. That's pretty wide open. And only men could initiate divorce. So if a man looks at his wife and she's somehow unpleasing to him, something in her is indecent, he doesn't like, he could divorce her and send her away. That's pretty wide open. The list of reasons for what's acceptable to get divorced in Jesus' day was a long, long list. Almost anything you could think of was good reasons for getting divorced. So, if you want to know what Jesus' disciples thought about divorce, he talks about this in Matthew 19. And so, another passage on divorce, Jesus says the same thing. I tell you, anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery. Listen to what the disciples say. The disciples said to him, if this is the situation between a husband and wife, it's better not to marry. The disciples were shocked at Jesus' narrow list of reasons for divorce. He has one reason, sexual immorality. And Jesus' disciples, these are good guys. These are good Jews who follow the law. And they said, Jesus, if that's the way it's going to be, that we can only divorce our wife if she cheats on us, it's better not even to get married. Why would I want to get married if that's the kind of commitment that you're looking for? Okay, it's better, if we have to love our wives that persistently, it's better not even to get married. That was their view on marriage and divorce. They had much freer rules of divorce than what Jesus was teaching. Okay, so it might surprise you. It's not that different than today. We think, divorce is such a big deal today. Everyone's getting divorced. It's rampant. It was just as rampant in Jesus' day, maybe even more so. Jewish men got divorced pretty regularly. Josephus, who's a famous Jewish historian, got divorced 5 times, I think. So here's what Jesus says. Here's what the New Testament says about divorce. We're going to do a quick survey here. In Mark, there's another one. Some Pharisees asked Jesus, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Jesus says, what did Moses command you? And they reply, write a certificate of divorce and send her away, that one that we just looked at. Jesus says, it's because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote to you this law. But as the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. So Jesus says, marriage is for life. Let's make this last. When they get to the house, the disciples ask Jesus again, and he says, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery. So that's the passage from Mark. No divorce, no remarriage. Luke, basically exactly the same. No divorce, no remarriage. Then we come to Matthew, what we looked at, and Jesus says the same thing, no divorce, no remarriage, except, so Jesus gives an exception here, except for sexual immorality. So if there's been something in the marriage adulterous, Jesus gives that exception. And then we go to Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, and Paul gives another couple of exceptions. If you're married, if you're a Christian and you're married to a non-Christian, Paul says, if that's the case and the non-Christian leaves, this marriage is just not going to work, Paul says you're not bound to that marriage. God's called us to live in peace. And then he says later in that passage, are you bound to a wife? Don't seek to be free. The word free, most translations don't put this in as divorce, but it can just as easily mean divorce. Are you bound to a wife? Don't seek to be divorced. Are you divorced from a wife? Don't seek a wife. But if you do marry, you haven't sinned. Okay? So Paul opens up another door here on the whole divorce remarriage thing. So I want to sum this up here in one slide. In Mark, Jesus says no divorce, no remarriage, no exceptions. In Luke, no divorce, no remarriage, no exceptions. In Matthew, no divorce, no remarriage, except for sexual immorality. Now Jesus throws in an exception. And in 1 Corinthians, no divorce, no remarriage, except if one of the partners is an unbeliever. Now, this is not a law. Don't read this as the list of rules. In fact, if any one of these is the rule, it contradicts the other one, right? Jesus contradicts Paul. Paul contradicts Jesus. The point of this is not here's the exact rules for when and why we get divorced and remarried. For example, spousal abuse is not on this list. And because it's not on that list, sometimes Wives have stayed in abusive marriages for decades because Jesus and Paul didn't say anything about it. I think it would be on the list for Jesus and Paul. I'm quite sure it would be. The point was not to give you a list. If you know anything about Jesus and Paul, their ministries were not to give you a whole bunch of list of rules. They were actually doing something quite opposite to that. They were giving you a new ethic, a new way of living. This is how we're going to live, not according to just here's all the exact rules. Jesus wants us to love our spouses, to cherish them, that when there's something that's leading us away from them, we rip it out immediately. Remember the Jews, their list for reasons for divorce was massive. There was hundreds of things on this list of why it was okay to get divorced and marry someone else. Jesus and Paul are narrowing this way down to just a couple things that make the list. Basically, these are the things that make a marriage unlivable. You cannot live with your spouse if they're sleeping with somebody else. It just does not work. If there's adultery in a marriage, it can be healed. That marriage can survive. We saw an example of it already this morning. But that's a marriage that's not livable, and Jesus gives us a way out of that marriage. If you're living with an unbeliever, that can work. You can live many years a Christian spouse with a non-Christian spouse. But Jesus or Paul says, if that's not working, if they won't live with you, Paul says you're not bound. That's a way out. I would say abusive marriages is another third one that's unlivable. You can't live in a marriage where your safety is at risk, where someone else is abusing you. And I think if you ask Jesus and Paul, they would agree. This is not in Scripture. This is my words, not Jesus' words or Paul's words. But the principle that they're giving you here is things that are unlivable. Their point is not to give you, here's the exact things why you can get divorced and why not. Their point is, there's a huge list that the Jews had, and our culture, we've got a huge list of why it's okay to leave this husband or wife and go find someone else. They want to take that huge list and narrow it down to only a couple little things that actually constitute real reasons for divorce and remarriage. Divorce is never a good thing. It's painful. It often has lifelong damaging effects for both parties. Sometimes, unfortunately, a very few times, it's the only option. So the point of their argument and ours is our reasons. I'm just not really in love with that person anymore. The spark is gone. We just don't feel it anymore. Those might be good reasons for breaking up with a boyfriend or girlfriend. Those are not good reasons for getting divorced. I just don't feel it. Something's gone. We've fallen out of love, those kind of reasons. Those aren't on the list. And seeing someone else that you'd rather be married to instead of your spouse, that is definitely not on the list. So Jesus wants his followers to radically rethink divorce and remarriage. Remember what the disciples said. They said, if that's the way it is, Jesus, if there's just a couple things on the list, it's better not even to get married. They had this idea that the list was huge. And so for us, we want to say the list is really small. Unfortunately, there are still a couple things on the list. So we're called to live lives entirely differently when it comes to marriage and sex. We look around and we see how broken this world is in terms of marriage and divorce and adultery, and often we see how broken Christians are as well. Many of you have heard that, Christians get divorced just as much as non-Christians, right? Probably most of us have heard that. I don't know how many of you know that that's not true at all. Lots of people preach that and say that. I used to say it because I thought it was true until I came across the studies that if you go to church faithfully every Sunday, your chance of getting divorced is 35% less than if you don't. Actually, it makes a difference if you go to church. So Christians don't get divorced at the same rate as outside the church. It's not true. But our media is flooded with images and ideas that seek to draw us away from our spouse, that seek to draw us into something, if we're single, that's not going to satisfy us the way that only marriage is supposed to satisfy us. Maintaining a strong, healthy marriage is hard work. Sometimes it takes the effort of cutting off your own hand, plucking out your eye, breaking your phone, whatever it is. As broken as our world is, that first century was no different. There's nothing new under the sun. The world Jesus talked to was very much the same as our world. There's always going to be people who undermine marriage, who make it a joke, who try to say there's something more you can add, there's something better out there, the grass is going to be greener on the other side. It might be an image on a computer screen. It might be another relationship that makes us feel special. But our call as beatitude people, as followers of Jesus, is to rise above this, to live out a higher calling. We have the same temptations as the rest of the world. Don't be surprised by that. Don't be ashamed of that. But when we see those temptations come, we pluck them out. It's like plucking out an eye. We cut off our hand. We radically get rid of anything in our life that might lead us away from our spouse. And if we're single, we radically get rid of things that might lead us away from anything other than what God has designed for us. We take marriage seriously. Leaving for someone better is not an option. Our marriage vows mean something. When I do marriage counseling, I've married lots of people. I tell them the rings don't really mean much. The piece of paper you're going to sign for the government of Manitoba doesn't mean much. The songs don't mean much. My sermon doesn't mean much. The only thing that really matters are those vows that you speak to each other. You're going to stand up in front of everyone and you're going to say, I will love you until we die. I will be faithful to you for the rest of my life. And for those of us who are married, we've made those vows. And as beatitude people, as Jesus' followers, we take that seriously. So seriously that if anything shows up that might steer us away from that, we get rid of it immediately. So for married people, our call is to guard our marriages and take Jesus' advice seriously. To know that as God's chosen people, we do marriage differently. We don't get our script from TV or from movies. We get it from the words of Jesus. And for single people, it's the principle of radically amputating anything in your life that might cause you to sin. Applies just as well to you. Just because you can't commit adultery doesn't mean you can't guard yourself just as strongly. So it's a high calling, what Jesus has for marriage. It's way higher than what his disciples thought. It's way higher than what the world thinks. But to me, this is not a burden. This is not, oh man, now I have to live this way in my marriage. I'm thankful for this. This is a good way to live. This is a good way to do marriage. This is the kind of living that leads to getting 50 years down the road and still holding hands and loving each other. That's the kind of marriage I want. And living Jesus' way of radically getting rid of anything in your life that's going to lead you astray, it's a good way to live. These are serious words this morning, but they're not, and they're heavy, sure, they're heavy, but they're good. This is a good way to live your marriage. And I want to encourage all of us who are in marriages to live Jesus' way in our marriage. That anything that comes along that might possibly draw us apart, that we identify that right away and we get rid of it. And we just say, thank you, Jesus, for giving us this good way of doing it. It's a good way to live. I would way rather have a Christian marriage than a non-Christian marriage any day of the week. These are good ways to live. It's a high call, but a good call. Let's pray.